In the final weeks of April 1945, Soviet soldiers advancing through the rubble-strewn streets of Berlin encountered an enemy that would haunt their memories long after the war ended. Standing in the path of T-34 tanks, clutching single-shot Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons with trembling hands, were children. Some wore uniforms several sizes too large. Others still had the round faces of boyhood, cheeks not yet hardened by adolescence. They were members of the Hitler Youth and the Volkssturm, the last desperate gamble of a collapsing regime. They were 12 years old, 13, 14, and they were expected to stop the Red Army. What happened next was inevitable, tragic, and rooted in years of calculated indoctrination. These children did not stumble into war by accident. They were shaped for it, molded by a system that had spent more than a decade preparing them to die for ideals they could barely understand. The story of why German child soldiers were shot by enemy forces is not simply about the chaos of war's end. It is about what happens when a nation feeds its youth into the machinery of ideology, when childhood becomes a military training ground, and when desperation transforms boys into soldiers long before they should have known what a battlefield looked like. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the war forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The origins of this tragedy began long before the first Soviet shell exploded over Berlin. They began in 1926, when the Hitler Youth was officially established as the youth wing of the Nazi Party. In those early years, it was a fringe organization, one among many youth movements competing for membership in Weimar Germany. But when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, everything changed. The Hitler Youth had approximately 100,000 members at the start of that year. By December, membership had surged to over 2 million. This was not organic growth. It was the result of systematic pressure, state encouragement, and the gradual elimination of competing youth organizations. The Nazi regime understood that the future of the Reich depended on controlling the minds of the young. Children were malleable, impressionable, and capable of absorbing ideology with an intensity that adults, shaped by prior experience, could not match. Hitler himself believed this. He once declared that the youth would be a force before whom the world would tremble. That vision was not metaphor, it was policy. By 1936, the law concerning the Hitler Youth declared that all German youth within Reich territory belonged to the organization. In March 1939, membership became compulsory for all children aged 10 to 18. By the outbreak of war in September 1939, the Hitler Youth had grown to 8.8 million members, encompassing nearly every child in Germany. But the Hitler Youth was not a scout troop. It was not an after-school club where children learned campfire songs and practiced knot tying. It was a paramilitary organization designed to prepare boys for combat and girls for the support roles that would sustain the war effort. Boys were organized into units that mirrored military structure. They learned to march in formation. They practiced handling weapons, including rifles and grenades. They studied map reading, fieldcraft, and the principles of infantry tactics. Physical fitness was paramount. Boys engaged in rigorous sports, especially boxing, which was intended to cultivate aggression and resilience. On summer camps held in rural areas, they lived under quasi-military discipline, sleeping in tents, enduring harsh conditions, and learning to obey orders without question. Girls in the League of German Girls, the female branch of the Hitler Youth, trained for different but equally vital roles. They learned nursing, first aid, cooking, sewing, and the skills necessary to manage households and raise children who would themselves become loyal servants of the Reich. Physical exercise for girls emphasized collective synchronization rather than individual competition, reinforcing the ideology that the individual existed to serve the whole. The Nazi state envisioned these young women as the mothers of future soldiers, the backbone of a demographic engine that would populate a 1,000-year Reich. Woven throughout this training was a relentless ideological curriculum. Children were taught that war was glorious, that sacrifice for the fatherland was the highest honor, and that dying for Hitler was a privilege. They learned that the Aryan race was superior, that Jews were subhuman enemies responsible for Germany's suffering, and that communists and Soviets were barbaric threats to civilization. These were not abstract lessons. They were drilled into the minds of children from the age of 10, reinforced through songs, speeches, rallies, and the constant presence of propaganda. Boys and girls attended Hitler Youth meetings multiple times per week, events that consumed their time and weakened the influence of parents, teachers, and religious institutions. Members were even encouraged to report on their own families if they heard dissenting views expressed at home. By 1945, an entire generation had grown up knowing nothing but Nazi ideology. Teenagers on the front lines had spent their entire conscious lives immersed in this worldview. Many believed it absolutely. They believed that Germany was fighting an existential struggle, that defeat would mean annihilation, and that their role was to stand and die if necessary. This was not fanaticism born of sudden desperation. It was the culmination of years of careful indoctrination. By 1944, the military situation facing Germany had become catastrophic. The Eastern Front, which had consumed the bulk of German military strength since the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, had turned into a graveyard. Operation Bagration, launched by the Soviets in June 1944, obliterated Army Group Center, inflicting over 400,000 German casualties in a single campaign. Entire divisions vanished. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, sent to Soviet prisoner of war camps, from which many would never return. On the Western Front, the Normandy landings in June 1944 opened a second theater of attrition that Germany could not sustain. By the autumn of 1944, the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS were facing a manpower crisis unprecedented in the history of the Reich. The numbers were grim. Total Wehrmacht losses by April 1945 amounted to over 11 million casualties, including more than 6 million wounded and nearly 5 million dead. The Eastern Front alone accounted for 80% of German military deaths. Entire cohorts of fighting-age men had been erased. Those who remained were exhausted, demoralized, or too old to serve effectively. The Reich was running out of soldiers. In October 1944, in a last-ditch effort to stave off collapse, Hitler authorized the formation of the Volkssturm, a national militia composed of all males aged 16 to 60 who were not already serving in the military. The Volkssturm was a desperate measure, a final scraping of the manpower barrel. Its members included elderly men in their 70s and 80s, veterans of the First World War who had not touched a rifle in decades, factory workers deemed essential to war production until the front came too close, and boys, thousands upon thousands of boys. The Volkssturm received minimal training. In many cases, inductees were handed weapons and given rudimentary instruction lasting a few hours or a single day. They were issued outdated rifles, often bolt-action models from World War I, and single-shot Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. The Panzerfaust was effective against armor if used correctly, but it required the operator to get within 50 meters of a tank, aim carefully, and fire without hesitation. For a boy who had never seen combat, facing a 30-ton Soviet T-34 grinding through rubble was a test beyond imagination. Many never fired their weapons. They froze, they ran, or they died before they had the chance to act. Alongside the Volkssturm, the regime mobilized the Hitler Youth directly for combat. In 1943, the Waffen-SS had formed the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed primarily of boys born in 1926, making them 16 or 17 years old when the division was deployed. These youths were paired with veteran SS officers and non-commissioned officers who served as mentors and enforcers. The division fought in Normandy, where it gained a reputation for tenacity, and also for committing war crimes, including the massacre of Canadian prisoners of war at Ardennes Abbey and the killing of French civilians in the Askew massacre. The young soldiers of the Hitlerjugend division fought with a ferocity born of indoctrination and inexperience, but by early 1945, the division had been bled white, its ranks decimated by months of continuous combat. In the Battle of Berlin, which began on April 16, 1945, the situation reached its darkest point. The city was defended by a patchwork of exhausted Wehrmacht units, Waffen-SS remnants, Volkssturm battalions, and thousands of Hitler Youth members. Some of these defenders were as young as 12. Alfred Czech, later known as Alfred Zeck, was one of them. Born in October 1932, Alfred was just 12 years old when he was pressed into service. His father had volunteered him for the Volkssturm, and Alfred, indoctrinated through years of Hitler Youth membership, accepted this as duty. On March 20, 1945, during fighting near his home in Silesia, Alfred helped evacuate wounded German soldiers under heavy Soviet mortar fire. For this act of bravery, he was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class by Adolf Hitler himself, making Alfred the youngest recipient of the decoration. Hitler, too weak to pin the medal on the boy's chest, watched as Arthur Axmann, the leader of the Hitler Youth, did so on his behalf. Alfred did not know that his father had already been killed in the fighting. He was later sent to the Eastern Front, where he was wounded and captured by Soviet forces. He spent time as a prisoner of war, a child among men, surviving an ordeal that would define the rest of his life. Alfred's story was not unique. Across Berlin, children were armed and sent into combat. They were given Panzerfausts and told to ambush Soviet tanks. They were assigned to anti-aircraft batteries, manning guns against Soviet bombers. They dug trenches, carried ammunition, and served as messengers running through streets swept by artillery and machine gun fire. Propaganda photographs from the period show Hitler inspecting these child soldiers in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, decorating boys whose faces still carried the softness of youth. These images were intended to project defiance and inspire resistance. Instead, they documented a regime cannibalizing its own future. For the Soviet Red Army, these child soldiers were enemies. The Soviet troops advancing into Berlin were battle-hardened veterans who had fought their way from Stalingrad to the Vistula, from the ruins of Minsk to the gates of the German capital. They had witnessed the brutality of the Eastern Front, seen their comrades killed by the tens of thousands, and endured unspeakable hardship. They had also been subjected to propaganda that dehumanized the enemy, portraying Germans as fascist monsters who deserved no mercy. When Soviet soldiers encountered children armed with weapons, they did not see victims of indoctrination. They saw threats. A boy of 12 holding a Panzerfaust was, in tactical terms, as dangerous as a grown man holding the same weapon. The Panzerfaust could destroy a tank and kill its crew. Soviet tank commanders had no way of knowing whether the figure crouching in a ruined building was a hardened SS trooper or a terrified child. In the chaos of urban combat, in streets, choked with smoke and debris, there was no time for hesitation. Soviet infantry and tank crews engaged any enemy combatant they encountered. Boys were shot. They were crushed beneath tank treads. They were killed by artillery, machine guns, and grenades. Soviet soldiers later recorded finding the bodies of children in German uniforms, sometimes still clutching unfired weapons, lying in the rubble of what had been their homes. One Soviet officer described discovering the body of a boy who appeared to be no more than 13, dressed in an oversized Volkssturm uniform, lying beside a smashed Panzerfaust. The officer noted that the boy was still wearing short trousers. The image haunted him. But in the moment of combat, in the heat of battle, there had been no choice. The boy had been armed. He had been an enemy combatant, and the war did not pause to consider age. The use of child soldiers in the final weeks of the war was not a sudden decision born of panic. It was the logical endpoint of a system that had spent over a decade preparing children for exactly this moment. The Hitler Youth had been designed to create soldiers. The ideology had been designed to make those soldiers willing to die. When the Reich faced annihilation, it turned to the one resource it had left, the boys it had indoctrinated since they were 10 years old. The regime knew these children would fight, it knew they would obey, and it knew they would die. Refusal to serve carried severe consequences. Boys who refused to take up arms risked being branded as traitors. Their families could be punished, arrested, or executed. In Berlin, deserters were hung from lampposts with signs around their necks declaring their cowardice. Local Nazi officials pressured parents to send their sons to the front. In some cases, boys were forcibly conscripted at gunpoint. The regime created an environment in which fighting, even in a hopeless cause, seemed preferable to the consequences of refusal. Thousands of children died in the defense of Berlin. Exact numbers are unknown, but estimates suggest that hundreds of boys under the age of 16 were killed in the final battles. Many died without ever firing a shot. They were killed by Soviet artillery barrages before they reached the front lines. They were caught in the open by machine gun fire. They were overwhelmed in close-quarters combat by soldiers who had been fighting for years and who showed no mercy to anyone in a German uniform. The streets of Berlin became a graveyard for a generation that had been taught to die for the Reich. The tragedy of the German child soldiers was not that they were shot. The tragedy was that they were there at all. They had been shaped by a regime that valued ideology over humanity, that saw children not as individuals deserving protection, but as tools to be used and discarded. The Nazi state had built an entire system to prepare these boys for this moment, and when the moment came, it sacrificed them without hesitation. After the war, the Hitler Youth and all Nazi organizations were officially disbanded. The Allied occupation authorities recognized the extent of the indoctrination and implemented denazification programs intended to re-educate German youth. But for those who had survived, the psychological scars were deep. Boys who had fought in Berlin carried the trauma of their experiences for the rest of their lives. Some struggled to reconcile what they had been taught with the reality of what they had witnessed. Others never fully escaped the ideology that had been drilled into them. Alfred Zeck, the boy who received the Iron Cross at age 12, eventually moved to West Germany after his release from Soviet captivity. He lived a quiet life, rarely speaking of his wartime experiences. When he did speak, he described the confusion, the fear, and the overwhelming sense that he had been used by a regime that cared nothing for him. He died in 2011, a man who had been a soldier before he was old enough to understand what that meant. The story of the German child soldiers is a reminder of what happens when ideology consumes a society, when the state claims ownership of childhood, and when desperation drives a regime to devour its own future. The boys who fought in Berlin were not monsters. They were victims of a system that had spent years preparing them to become casualties. When Soviet soldiers shot them, they were not committing atrocities. They were fighting an enemy who had been taught to kill them. The real crime was not what happened in the streets of Berlin in April 1945. The real crime was that those children were ever placed in uniform, handed weapons, and told that dying for the Reich was glorious. History does not record the names of most of the boys who died defending Berlin. They are buried in mass graves, forgotten in the chaos of the war's final collapse. But their story endures as a warning. It is a warning about the dangers of indoctrination, about the consequences of a state that treats its youth as instruments of war, and about the inevitable tragedy that follows when children are taught that death in battle is the highest honor they can achieve. The Soviet soldiers who killed those children carried the memory of it for the rest of their lives. Many later expressed horror at what they had done, even as they acknowledged that in the moment there had been no alternative. The boys had been armed. The war was real. And the age of the enemy did not change the fact that survival required killing anyone who stood in the way. This was the dark reason German child soldiers were shot. They were shot because they were there, because they had been trained to be there, and because a regime that had promised them glory delivered only death. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.